Those of you who watched my video last week saw me take the best of these two castings, these two Matchbox Volks-Dragon castings, and make one really cute Herbie the Love Bug variation. Now, while I used the best parts to make that one, I didn't want the scraps to go to waste. So while the last one was Herbie the Love Bug, I guess this is his brother, Howard the Hate Bug. Now, these pieces that were left were all kind of screwed up a little bit. The engine had some little chunks off of it. You see some 3D parts there that I'm going to use. I'm taking this in a Gaslands direction. So I drilled this casting out, and it was already stripped from last time. I stripped both castings to see what was best. And so, some of the work was already done, which makes this even easier. I used a self-tapping screw on this, which went really easily. And I didn't do a lot to clean the body up. I didn't go through any super polishing of it or anything. I took some sandpaper, roughed it up a little bit. The paint had been stripped off, so there was no paint remaining. But, it doesn't have to look great. I want it to look beat up. So started off just, roughing it up, making sure that, paint's going to stick to this really well. But I didn't really need to finesse anything on here. And then I thought, well, let's put drill some divots into this thing, like something's shot at it. So I didn't drill all the way through. Didn't want to do that. I figured I could achieve that look with paint, but I did drill through the passenger side or drill into the passenger side in some areas, one of the front fenders, some spots on the driver's side. Careful not to hit the driver's side door, because otherwise the driver wouldn't have made it. Didn't want that. So after doing that, I glued the engine on here. And as you'll see here in a second when I go to put the engine on, you'll see at the front lip of the intake up there on the top, you can see how there's like a chunk out of that top edge of it, which won't matter with what I'm going to do. But, and I didn't need to chrome this thing really or anything, we're going to see what happens with that. I did have a 3D printed hood scoop that I had bought from Benchworks. And so that was resin printed. And when you cut resin stuff, you got to be really careful. Otherwise, you're just going to snap it. And what I wanted to do is just cut the front section off of that. And obviously, I'm not doing a real straight, careful job on this. Everything was kind of slopped together. But I just extended that intake off of the stock Volks-Dragon broken one. Extended that out farther over the roof, which I figured would give it a good look. I CA glued that down. And then I kind of swapped some Squadron putty around it. Not terribly sloppy, but at the same time, I want it to look like somebody took some metal, hammered it out, made an additional scoop, and just kind of, funkily welded it on there. Then I wanted to put one gun centered on the hood. I had one of those that I pulled from the Silva Challenge box of parts. CA glued that in place. And I'm getting the look I want. It's not way over the top, but I thought it'd be kind of cool. And it's very different from Herbie. Those wheels, if you've watched the Silva Challenge boxings lately, you've seen me rave about the style of these wheels. There's something about them that ever since I printed them the first time, I just like the look of them. And I decided I wanted to throw them all the way around. 4, all the way around. Not smaller ones in the front, Didn't want to give it a tilt forward. I just wanted it to have a jacked up look, and figured I could achieve it with these. And yeah, I'll do more bugs, I'm certain in the future, in all kinds of shapes and sizes. But I kind of knew what I wanted to do with these scraps, and it wasn't super elaborate, but I kind of knew what I wanted to do. So you see me making some axle tubes, and I stuck those under the metal chassis, and I tacked them in place. The brass tube, I tacked those that I've cut down to size in place with CA glue. And yeah, it's coming in a little while, but I won't say it yet. Anybody that watches the channel knows what direction those are going to go. But so put those on, had those in place, as you see there. I'm happy with those. Then what I did is I cut out of that cardstock, and you'll see me making some patterns using the wheel wells for a rough size. Because with the jacked up body, you could see straight through above the tires, through the body, and I didn't want that. So a way for me to achieve that is I cut that cardstock, I tack it onto the chassis on both sides, on the back side of where the wheels will be. And again, I'm just tacking that lightly in place because there's a little trick I like to do with either cardstock or tape. And I'll show you that in a second. But I get the 4 of those where I want them, obviously above the axle itself. So that's how that ends up. So you see the cardstock. But again, that's just cardstock. And I'm not going to be too happy with that. Glue dots! Hey, glue dots! I've had glue dots around here, God, for years for various purposes. And one of the things that's fun to use them for, I found out, is to cover up axle tubes, to cover the ends of axle tubes, just so nothing gets in there. And with what I'm about to do, yeah, I wanted to cover those up. You just pluck them back off later. They stay soft. Mix up the JB Weld. Woohoo! JB Weld. And I go over the axle tubes, definitely holding those in place, giving it a smoother look over those axles. Smooth yet rough. The post-apocalyptic look you want. If this video seems a little goofy, it's because I'm kind of recording this voiceover late. And there you see what I like to do with JB Weld. I'll put it over stuff like cardstock. And I do it on both sides. And in effect, once that dries, you have a JB Weld sheet sticking up there. It's solid. That thing's not going anywhere. That hardens up, and it gives you that custom drape in there. I love doing this kind of stuff. It works so well and so easily, I think, is the thing. Once you use JB Weld to coat something like that, it loses all of its flexibility. It takes the shape that you've cut it. If the cardstock was too big, I could have easily trimmed it smaller before putting the JB Weld. If it was too small, I could have added to it. You can adjust it so easily, and then you just hit it with the JB Weld, and it firms that all up. And for me, it just works out so much better than fighting to cut styrene in the size you want. Yeah, there's times you want to cut styrene, and you'll get a much better looking finish. But for something like under a wheel well, that's an easy way to get there. Hit the body with red primer, which I love using on Gaslands builds as a base coat. I'm keeping this red color overall, and I'm just going to basically dry wash over this thing with paint. So I go over the engine section and that cobbled together scoop with silver. And I just proceed from there. And so I do a lot of dry brushing to different colors on here. Some you'll see, some you won't. You'll see in the end result. One of the things I like about using the primer as the paint in effect is you can easily go over it like with a brush, with a piece of sponge, and rough off sections. And it looks like wear. I considered rusting those spots, but I didn't want the rust look on this one. Done it before where I did. This one I didn't. But using the sponge like that works really well too. It's a dry sponge. It is not a wet sponge. Go over it with a dry sponge and it just rubs that stuff out and pulls out highlights. No build is complete without a little Nuln Oil. So it's kind of like I put the screens in and then they get sprayed red and then I repaint them silver and then I go over it with Nuln Oil to darken them up. And it's kind of like layer over layer over layer until you get the result you want. And that's kind of where I was on this. And like with the engine, I go over the engine as well with Nuln Oil. I dry brush that engine again with silver to pull out more silver out of the engine. The bullet holes, I basically hit those with some silver to make it look like the area surrounding the hole. And then I put black in the center of the hole to make it look like it goes all the way through. This is the back bumper of the car. It has been primer blacked at this point, and you see me taping it off because I'm about to dry brush it with yellow, giving that kind of caution tape, or I forget what it's called right now. But there's a word for that bar that you'll have on the back of things. And I just dry brushed that on. I didn't want it super bright yellow. I wanted it to be a dry brush look to it. And so I dry brushed. Yeah, dry brushing works so well. And it's almost like as long as you do it lightly, you can't really screw up because you're just doing it so lightly. It's where I screw up is when I try and do it too quickly and leave too much paint on the brush. But as long as it's not crazy too much, you just keep dry brushing it off of there. And, it works. Then because that chassis was, again, as I say, primer blacked, I sand the primer off the headlights. They're metal. This is a metal base. I sand the highlights to get the shine back to them. And it's kind of a dirty shine. I really like the way that turned out. I wasn't sure it was going to work as well as it did. But that's about it. I didn't do anything fancy on the interior. Again, I just hit that with black primer. I did go over all of these with matte clear. So it is all sealed. It's not like it's just raw primer. All of it is matte cleared. So I recall I used Rust-Oleum matte clear on this. Nothing too fancy. There I'm using the resin pin just to hit that little spot in the front of the interior to hold it in place. Not that it's going anywhere, it really fits in there perfectly. There's not a lot of play to it, but at this point it's just slapping those two sections together now. The headlights go through the openings in the front, and then the one screw in the back. Throw that in. You see I did little things like using red on the centers of the wheels, and you can also see how you don't see through that body. One of the things I like, I put these little blue and yellow stripes on the front fenders. I put other markings on there, an X on the back of the car. Just some fun markings. Almost like war paint in a way. So yeah, there's where we started. The funkier pieces out of those two cars ended up being this build. The better pieces of those two cars ended up being Herbie the Love Bug for the Diecast International Builders build. That video was uploaded. It should be a week before this one, if I time all these things out properly. That should have been on Saturday, August 5th, and this should be dropping Saturday, August 12th. There you have it. There's where it ended up. These things are just fun. There's something about the post-apocalyptic builds that, you know, they're just fun to do. I really like how those headlights turned out. That look of the headlights is just kind of cool to me. I also like the bullet holes in the sides. Yeah, I don't know. It was just fun. It was a very entertaining build to do. And took advantage of all the scraps left over from that last one. So there's some glamour shots coming up. I hope you enjoyed this build. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Definitely helps the channel. And thanks for watching. I really do appreciate it. Everybody stay safe and healthy out there. I'll catch you in the next one.